Robert Mackenzie's weathered hands trembled as he clutched his Purple Heart medal, whispering desperately to the motionless German shepherd on the steel veterinary table. "Take mine instead, boy." The heart monitor's flatline screech wasn't supposed to be Thor's final song. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's frantic compression sent shockwaves through the silence as her assistant stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of surgical instruments that clattered like broken promises across the linoleum floor. Eleanor Patterson burst through the emergency room doors, her granddaughter Grace clinging to her wheelchair, both staring in disbelief at the scene unfolding. Bob's mind flashed to 3 months earlier. That $100 ghost town purchase that had seemed like his ticket to peaceful solitude. How wrong he'd been. How gloriously, devastatingly wrong. "Get the defibrillator, now!" Dr. Mitchell commanded, though her eyes betrayed the truth they all feared. What had started as one lonely veteran's escape from the world had become a battle for the very soul that had taught him how to live again. Could love conquer what medicine could not? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, the Montana countryside stretched endlessly under an autumn sky that reminded Robert "Bob" Mackenzie of Margaret's favorite watercolor paintings. At 68, Bob carried the weight of Vietnam in his shoulders and the ache of recent loss in his gray eyes. The Purple Heart in his glove compartment had gathered dust for 47 years, much like the man who'd earned it. His wife Margaret's battle with cancer had ended 8 months ago, leaving him alone in a world that suddenly felt too loud, too crowded, too full of memories that cut like shattered glass. Thor, his 6-year-old German shepherd, sat in the passenger seat with the patience of a seasoned soldier. The dog's silver-gray coat caught the afternoon light, making him appear almost ethereal against the worn truck upholstery. Thor had been Bob's lifeline since Margaret's funeral. A former police dog retired early due to what the veterinarians diplomatically called stress-related behavioral issues. In simpler terms, Thor had PTSD just like his human companion. They'd found each other at a VA therapy program, two broken souls learning to navigate a world that didn't quite make sense anymore. Millfield County was dying a slow death. Bob had watched it happen from his small trailer on the outskirts of Bozeman. Family farms foreclosed, young people fleeing to cities, elderly residents left behind like forgotten photographs in empty houses. The local newspaper's classified section told the story in stark numbers. More estate sales than job listings, more funerals than weddings, more goodbyes than hellos. That's when Bob had seen the auction notice. Willowbrook, an entire ghost town for sale to the highest bidder. 12 abandoned buildings, a main street swallowed by weeds, and 43 acres of silence. And the minimum bid was $100. Bob had scraped together the money from his disability checks, not because he needed property, but because he needed peace. A place where a man can disappear, he told Thor during one of their late-night conversations that Margaret used to call therapy sessions. The plan was simple. Build a small memorial garden for Margaret among the ruins, let Thor chase rabbits through the abandoned streets, and wait quietly for whatever came next. At his age, tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, but today still mattered. If only because Thor needed him to matter. Bob's refrigerator back home told the story of his isolation. Expired milk, half-empty whiskey bottle, and Thor's heart medication. The calendar on his kitchen wall hadn't been turned since March, the month Margaret died. Friends from the VA had stopped calling after their invitations to coffee, and support group meetings went unanswered. Bob Mackenzie had become a ghost long before he'd bought his ghost town. As their pickup truck bounced along the dirt road toward Willowbrook, Thor's ears perked up with interest. The dog possessed an intuition that had saved Bob's life more than once, an ability to sense danger, fear, and surprisingly hope, long before his human companion could recognize it. Today, Thor's alert posture suggested something significant awaited them in their $100 sanctuary. The pickup truck's engine coughed to silence as Bob shifted into park, the sound echoing strangely in the profound stillness of Willowbrook. Dust settled around them like a gentle shroud, and for a moment, Bob felt the peace he'd been seeking. 12 weathered buildings lined what had once been Main Street, their wooden bones bleached gray by decades of Montana sun and snow. The old saloon sign dangled from a single rusted chain, creaking rhythmically in the afternoon breeze. Weeds pushed through cracks in the wooden sidewalks with the persistence of life refusing to surrender. "Well, boy," Bob murmured, running his hand over Thor's thick coat, "looks like we got what we paid for." Thor's response wasn't the relaxed panting Bob expected. Instead, the German shepherd's ears snapped to attention, his body going rigid with alertness. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest as his amber eyes fixed on the largest building at the end of the street, the old general store. Bob's military training kicked in instantly. In 47 years, he'd learned to trust Thor's instincts more than his own eyes. The dog sensed things that human senses missed, danger that lurked beyond normal perception. "What is it, boy?" Bob whispered, his hand instinctively moving to Thor's collar. Instead of the absolute silence he'd paid for, Bob began to notice subtle inconsistencies. The faintest trace of wood smoke drifted on the breeze, and one window of the general store seemed cleaner than the others, as if someone had wiped away years of grime. Thor took a cautious step forward, then another, his paws silent on the dusty ground. He wasn't barking aggressively, but his low, questioning whine carried a clear message. Someone is here. The dog looked back at Bob, his intelligent eyes seeking permission, or perhaps offering a warning. Bob followed Thor's lead, moving with the measured caution of a man who'd survived too many ambushes to ignore his instincts. They crept along the dilapidated boardwalk, the ancient wood groaning under Bob's weight despite his careful steps. As they approached the general store, the feeling of being watched intensified. Thor stopped at the foot of the porch steps and released another soft bark, not threatening but announcing their presence with dignity. Before Bob could process the implications, a voice cut through the afternoon air. "That's far enough." The words came from behind the weathered door of the general store, accompanied by the unmistakable metallic click of a shotgun being cocked. The sound transported Bob instantly back to rice paddies and jungle clearings, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The front door creaked open just enough for twin barrels to emerge, followed by the person holding them. She was an elderly woman, perhaps in her mid-70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that held the fierce determination of a mother bear protecting her cubs. Her weathered hands gripped the shotgun with surprising steadiness, the barrels aimed squarely at Bob's chest. "This is private property," she declared, her voice trembling slightly but firm with resolve. "State your business and be on your way." Behind her, Bob caught a glimpse of something that made his breath catch. A small figure huddled in the shadows, too small to be an adult, too still to be healthy. Bob slowly raised his hands, keeping them open and visible. "I mean you no harm, ma'am," he said, his voice calm and even. "My name is Robert Mackenzie, and I just bought this town. The deed is in my truck." Beside him, Thor sat calmly, his presence somehow more reassuring than any words Bob could offer. The dog's disciplined stillness seemed to ease the tension more effectively than Bob's peaceful gestures. The woman's eyes flickered between Bob and Thor, uncertainty warring with exhaustion across her weathered features. "Bought it?" she repeated, the shotgun wavering slightly. "You're lying. Nobody wants this place. Nobody comes here." "I understand this might be your home," Bob replied gently, "but I have legal ownership papers in my truck. Every building, all 43 acres. The words hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds, his desire for solitude and her desperate need for shelter. After what felt like an eternity, the woman slowly lowered the weapon. "My name is Eleanor Patterson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if you truly own this place, then I suppose you should come inside." She opened the door wider, revealing the shadows behind her. Bob gave Thor a quiet command to stay, and the loyal dog immediately lay down on the porch, his watchful eyes never leaving the doorway. Bob stepped into the dim interior of the general store, the air inside cool and heavy with the scent of dust, dried herbs, and something that smelled heartbreakingly like homemade soup. The interior revealed a living space carved from necessity. Blankets hung from ropes to create makeshift rooms, wooden crates served as furniture, and the old shelves now held a meager collection of canned goods and carefully folded clothes. It was sparse but immaculately clean, transformed from an abandoned building into someone's last refuge. Eleanor gestured for Bob to sit on an overturned crate before sinking onto another, her hands trembling as she set the shotgun against the wall. "My husband Thomas built his whole life in this county," she began, her voice distant with memory. "We had a small ranch just east of here. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." Her voice caught. "He died last winter. Pneumonia took him fast." The story that tumbled out was a familiar tale of rural American tragedy. After Thomas's funeral, representatives from Millfield County Savings had arrived with papers bearing her dead husband's signature, claiming he'd taken substantial loans for farm improvements that Eleanor had never seen. The signature looked perfect, too perfect, nothing like Thomas's usual hurried scrawl. "Thomas hated debt more than anything," Eleanor said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He'd rather fix something with wire and prayer than borrow money for new. But they had documents, legal papers. As a widow, I had no standing to contest them." The bank had taken everything, the ranch, the house, even Thomas's old truck. They'd left Eleanor with nothing but the clothes on her back and a granddaughter who needed more care than an elderly woman could provide alone. "We walked here," Eleanor finished, exhaustion weighing down every word. "It was the only shelter for 100 miles. As if summoned by Eleanor's words, a sound emerged from behind one of the blanket partitions, a terrible wet cough that seemed to tear through the small space like broken glass. The sound was weak, yet violent, ending in a breathless gasp that made Bob's chest tighten with recognition. He'd heard that sound before, in field hospitals and VA wards, the sound of someone fighting for every breath. Eleanor's weathered face immediately transformed, all traces of wariness dissolving into pure, unadulterated fear. "Grace," she breathed, rushing toward the makeshift bedroom with the desperate urgency of someone who'd heard that cough too many times before. Through a gap in the hanging blankets, Bob caught his first glimpse of Eleanor's granddaughter. Grace Patterson was perhaps 9 years old, though illness had stolen the robust health that should have defined childhood. She was painfully thin, her skin pale and translucent, stretched taut over delicate bones. Dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises, making them appear too large for her small face. When she saw Bob, those fever-bright eyes widened not with curiosity, but with the deep, weary caution of a child who'd learned that strangers often brought trouble. But it was Grace's lips that told the real story, tinged with the faint blue of winter sky, a telltale sign that Bob recognized from his own medical struggles. This wasn't just a cold or flu. This was something far more serious, something that required doctors and hospitals and money that Eleanor clearly didn't have. The sight of Grace, so fragile, so desperately sick, struck Bob with the force of a physical blow. He'd witnessed suffering in many forms during his years in Vietnam and afterward, but the quiet, helpless suffering of a child was something that never failed to crack the careful walls he'd built around his heart. Watching Eleanor gently wipe Grace's face with a damp cloth, seeing the absolute desperation in the older woman's eyes, Bob felt those walls crumble like paper. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving Eleanor to draw a sharp breath behind him, a sound of renewed fear, thinking perhaps he was abandoning them, or worse, going to call authorities to have them removed. But Bob ignored her distress, his mind focused on a single objective. He strode back to his truck where Thor waited patiently, the dog's intelligent eyes tracking his human's determined movements. Bob opened the passenger door and pulled out a large cardboard box from behind the seat. It contained his own emergency supplies, canned beans, salted meat, coffee, and several bags of rice he'd bought in preparation for his solitary life in the ghost town. He also grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets and his largest water container, which he'd filled with fresh water that morning from the well at his old trailer. When he returned to the porch and set the box down in front of the open door, he didn't offer explanations or conditions. This wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, more fundamental. It was one human being recognizing another's desperate need and responding with the simple dignity that his generation had been raised to consider basic decency. Thor padded up the steps and gently nudged the box with his nose, then looked up at Eleanor with those amber eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. The dog's gesture was somehow more eloquent than words, a quiet endorsement of his human's decision. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her face a canvas of disbelief and dawning hope. She stared at the supplies as if they might disappear if she looked away, her hands trembling with the effort of not reaching out immediately. We can't," she began, but her voice failed her. "Yes, you can," Bob said quietly, his first words since leaving the store. "And you will." It wasn't a command, but a statement of fact, delivered with the gentle authority of someone who'd learned that sometimes accepting help required more courage than offering it. From inside the store came another bout of coughing, weaker than before, and Eleanor's resolve crumbled. She knelt beside the box, her weathered hands touching the supplies with reverence, as if they were sacred objects rather than simple food and blankets. "Why?" she whispered, looking up at Bob with tears streaming down her cheeks. "You don't even know us." "We're nothing to you." Bob looked through the doorway at Grace, who was watching them with those 2 large eyes, and then at Thor, who had positioned himself protectively near the entrance. "A man's word is his bond," he said, echoing the old phrase his father had taught him decades ago. "Well, I made a promise to myself when I bought this place. I promised to find peace here. Can't have peace knowing a child is suffering." The truth was more complicated than that simple explanation. Bob had come to Willowbrook seeking to disappear, to fade quietly away from a world that had taken too much from him. But looking at Grace and Eleanor, he realized that disappearing wasn't the same as dying, and dying wasn't the same as living. Margaret had always said that the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and perhaps this was one of those mysteries, that his search for an ending had instead brought him to a beginning. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightening her shoulders with visible effort. "We'll pay you back," she said with fierce dignity. "I don't know how or when, but we will. The Pattersons don't take charity." "It's not charity," Bob replied, and he meant it. "It's an investment. This town's been dead for 20 years. Maybe it's time it had some life in it again." He looked at Thor, who had settled onto the porch as if he'd always belonged there. "Besides, looks like my dog's already made up his mind about where he wants to live." As if to confirm Bob's words, Thor rose and walked calmly into the store, where Grace was struggling to sit up despite her weakness. The big German shepherd approached the makeshift bed with the gentle precision of a therapy dog, lying down beside the cot so that Grace could reach him without effort. When the little girl's thin hand found Thor's thick fur, Both child and dog seemed to exhale with relief, as if they'd been waiting their entire lives for this moment of connection. Eleanor watched the scene with wonder. "I think," she said softly, "that dog knows something we don't." She was right, though none of them could have imagined just how much Thor understood, or how much he was already prepared to sacrifice for the small family that had just entered his life. An agreement had been forged, not with words or legal documents, but with a box of food, a moment of trust, and the simple recognition that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we stop running away and start standing still. Bob and Thor had come to Willowbrook seeking silence and solitude. Instead, they had found purpose, responsibility, and the first stirrings of something that felt remarkably like home. For 2 days, a fragile peace settled over Willowbrook like morning mist on the Montana prairie. Bob worked with his hands, finding steady rhythm in the honest labor of securing loose boards on the general store's porch and patching a section of roof that had been bleeding autumn rain into Eleanor's makeshift kitchen. He wasn't a carpenter by trade, but 47 years of fixing things that the military and life had broken had taught him the value of methodical persistence. Eleanor moved through their shared space with quiet gratitude, insisting on preparing thin but nourishing stews from Bob's supplies, which they ate together in comfortable silence around a small table fashioned from wooden crates. Grace remained mostly out of sight, her presence felt primarily through the muffled sounds of her labored breathing and occasional conversations with Thor, who had appointed himself as her constant guardian. The German shepherd's behavior had shifted dramatically since their arrival. Where once he had been Bob's shadow, following his every movement with military precision, Thor now divided his attention between his longtime companion and the sick child, who seemed to understand him in ways that transcended species. Bob would find them together in the late afternoons, Grace's small hand buried in Thor's thick coat, while she whispered secrets that made the dog's ears twitch with attention. "That animal knows something we don't," Eleanor observed one evening as they watched Thor carefully position himself between Grace's bed and the door, as if standing guard against invisible threats. "Dogs can sense things about illness that doctors miss. My Thomas used to say animals could smell sickness on a person's breath, feel it in their heartbeat." Bob nodded, remembering how Thor had seemed restless in the weeks before Margaret's final decline, pacing and whining when the doctors still insisted she was responding well to treatment. The dog possessed an intuition that bordered on supernatural, an ability to perceive the world through senses that humans had forgotten they once possessed. The peace was shattered on the third morning by the distant drone of an engine cutting through the prairie stillness. Thor's head shot up from where he'd been lying beside Grace's bed, his ears swiveling to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. A low rumble emerged from his chest, not aggressive, but warning, the sound of a soldier alerting his unit to approaching danger. Bob set down his hammer and straightened, his body automatically assuming the alert posture that had kept him alive in hostile territory decades ago. Through the cracked window of the general store, he watched a Millfield County Sheriff's vehicle appear on the dirt road, kicking up a brown plume of dust that stained the clear Montana sky like a scar. The patrol car came to an abrupt stop in front of the store, its engine idling with an arrogant rumble that seemed designed to announce authority. The driver's door opened, and a large man squeezed himself out with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to intimidating others through sheer physical presence. Sheriff Daniel Crawford was in his early 50s, with a fleshy, florid face that suggested a fondness for whiskey and the kind of easy living that came from abusing power rather than earning respect. His uniform was stretched taut across a prominent belly, and his small, calculating eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had learned to hunt within the boundaries of the law. A permanent smirk played at the corners of his mouth, the expression of a man who had never been seriously challenged. Two deputies emerged from the vehicle after him. The first was young, perhaps 25, with nervous eyes and a uniform that still carried the crisp newness of recent hiring. He fidgeted with his utility belt and avoided making eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with whatever mission had brought them to this abandoned place. The second deputy was older, leaner, with a cynical glint in his eye and the posture of someone who had learned to enjoy the authority that came with a badge and gun. Crawford ignored Bob completely, his attention focused on Eleanor, who had appeared in the doorway of the store. Her face had gone pale with dread, the color draining from her cheeks like water from a broken vessel. The sight of law enforcement clearly triggered memories of previous encounters that hadn't ended well for her. "Eleanor Patterson," Crawford said, his voice oozing false pleasantry that fooled no one. "I was hoping I'd find you here. Save me a long ride out to your old property." He paused, tapping his chin in mock thought. "Oh, wait, that's not your property anymore, is it? Silly me." The younger deputy shifted his feet uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by his superior's casual cruelty. The older deputy simply smirked, apparently enjoying the psychological warfare being deployed against an elderly woman and sick child. "What do you want, Crawford?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with controlled fear. She had stepped fully outside now, positioning herself between the law enforcement officers and the interior of the store where Grace lay hidden behind hanging blankets. Crawford pulled a folded sheaf of papers from his shirt pocket, unfolding them with theatrical flourish like a magician, revealing his final trick. "Just following up on some official business," he announced. "According to my friends down at Millfield County Savings, you still have an outstanding debt. $800 plus accumulated fees and penalties." He paused for effect, studying the papers as if seeing them for the first time. "Since you have no assets to seize, the bank has filed complaints for trespassing and vagrancy. I'm here to escort you and the child off this property." The papers were clearly a pretext, a flimsy legal justification wrapped in official language and county letterhead. Bob could see through the charade immediately. This wasn't about enforcing the law, it was about harassment, about using the power of the state to bully people who lacked the resources to fight back. "This is my home now," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but defiant. "We're not bothering anyone. We're not breaking any laws." Crawford's laugh was short and ugly, the sound of someone who found genuine distress amusing. "This is a ghost town, sweetheart. Nobody lives in ghost towns." "That's why they're called ghost towns." He nodded toward his older deputy, Collins, who began walking toward the porch with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to compliance. "Collins, be a gentleman and help the lady with her things," Crawford commanded. "Make sure she understands the urgency of the situation." Deputy Collins approached the porch with his hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm, more habit than threat, but intimidating nonetheless. He took one step onto the wooden boards, then another, his boots creating hollow sounds that echoed in the afternoon air. He never made it to the third step. In a blur of gray and white fur, Thor launched himself from his position inside the store, moving with the lightning precision of a military working dog defending his territory. But this wasn't a wild attack. It was something far more controlled and therefore more terrifying. Thor landed silently between Collins and the store entrance, planting his feet in a perfect defensive stance that blocked access to Grace and Eleanor. The dog's head was low, his hackles raised along his spine like a ridge of silver-tipped spears. A growl emerged from deep in his chest, resonant and primal as an earthquake, vibrating through the wooden porch and into the bones of everyone present. His lips peeled back just enough to reveal formidable white teeth, and his amber eyes locked onto the deputy with lethal intensity. Thor didn't lunge or snap. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of protective fury, making it clear that any further advance would be met with consequences that Collins was not prepared to face. The message was crystal clear. This far and no farther. Collins froze mid-stride, his hand hovering over his weapon as his face suddenly drained of color. The young deputy took an involuntary step backward, bumping into the patrol car's front bumper. Even Sheriff Crawford's smug expression faltered slightly, replaced by a flash of genuine concern and perhaps the first flicker of fear he'd experienced in years. Bob pushed himself off the porch column where he'd been leaning, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Crawford responded to volume with more volume, escalating situations until someone got hurt. Instead, Bob spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "He's not bothering anyone," Bob said, his voice flat and cold as winter steel. "He's on my property. You, however, are harassing guests of mine." Crawford's attention was finally, forcefully drawn to the silent man on the porch. "Your property?" he scoffed, though his eyes kept darting nervously toward Thor, who hadn't moved a muscle, but somehow seemed to grow more menacing with each passing second. "I have the deed, filed with the county clerk yesterday morning," Bob replied calmly. "This town, this store, this very patch of dirt you're standing on belongs to me, and I'm telling you to leave these people alone." The sheriff found himself trapped in a situation his usual bullying tactics couldn't resolve. The combination of a growling German shepherd who looked ready and willing to remove a throat and a man who stood with the unshakable stillness of a mountain was something his playbook of intimidation hadn't prepared him for. Bob wasn't afraid of him, wasn't backing down, wasn't showing any of the deference that Crawford had come to expect from civilians. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was Thor's menacing growl, a rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The autumn wind had died completely, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see how this confrontation would resolve. Finally, Crawford's face hardened into a mask of official outrage. He knew he had lost this particular battle, but sheriffs like Daniel Crawford didn't forget defeats, and they rarely forgave the people who handed them those defeats. He pointed a thick finger at Bob, his voice rising with the bluster of wounded authority. "You're making a big mistake, friend," he said, the word friend dripping with venom. "Harboring debtors, obstructing a law officer in the performance of his duties. I'll be back, and when I return, I'll have warrants for her arrest, and one for yours too." He turned on his heel and stomped back to his vehicle, his deputies following quickly behind him. The older deputy, Collins, cast one last hateful glare at Thor before slamming his door with unnecessary force. The car roared to life, spun around in a spray of gravel and dust, and sped away down the dirt road, leaving only a lingering cloud of exhaust and the bitter taste of unfinished business hanging in the air. Bob finally allowed himself to exhale, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He placed a gentle hand on Thor's head, and the dog's growl subsided instantly, though his body remained alert and ready. The immediate danger had passed, but the shadow of legal authority now loomed darker than ever over their fragile sanctuary. Eleanor sagged against the doorframe, the adrenaline leaving her system and taking with it the temporary strength that fear had provided. "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice hollow with exhaustion and dread. "And next time he won't come alone. Men like Crawford don't let things like this go." Bob nodded grimly. He knew she was right. They had won this skirmish, but the war was just beginning. Crawford would return with reinforcements, with legal documents that couldn't be intimidated by even the most loyal dog, and with the full weight of a corrupt system behind him. But as Bob looked down at Thor, who had positioned himself protectively between the store and the road, and then at Eleanor, who despite her fear was standing straighter than she had since his arrival, he realized something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about his search for solitude or Eleanor's need for shelter. This had become about something larger. about standing up to bullies, about protecting the innocent, about proving that sometimes, even in a world that seemed to favor the powerful, ordinary people could fight back and win. The ghost town of Willowbrook had just become a battleground, and Bob Mackenzie, whether he'd planned it or not, had just enlisted in a war he wasn't sure he could win but knew he couldn't walk away from. The dust from Crawford's retreat had barely settled when Grace's terrified scream pierced the afternoon air like a blade through silk. Eleanor dropped the water bucket she'd been carrying and rushed toward the hanging blankets that separated Grace's makeshift bedroom from the main store, her face transformed by primal maternal panic. Bob was right behind her, Thor already in motion, his protective instincts triggered by the sound of distress from the child he'd sworn to guard. They found Grace sitting up in her bed of stacked pallets and worn quilts, her small body rigid with fear, pointing a trembling finger at the window that faced the road. "The mean man," she gasped between labored breaths, her voice barely above a whisper. "He looked right at me. He smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile." Bob moved to the window and peered carefully through the grime-streaked glass. Crawford's vehicle was indeed gone, but tire tracks in the soft earth told a different story. The sheriff had circled back, parking behind the old saloon where his car wouldn't be visible from the store's front entrance. He'd been watching them, studying their movements, gathering intelligence like a predator learning the habits of his prey. "He's making sure we know he can come back any time he wants," Bob said grimly, his military mind automatically cataloging the tactical disadvantages of their position. The general store sat exposed on the main street with multiple approaches and too many windows to monitor effectively. They were sitting ducks in a shooting gallery. Eleanor knelt beside Grace's bed, smoothing the child's sweat-dampened hair with trembling hands. "It's okay, sweetheart. Grandpa Bob and Thor won't let anything happen to you." But even as she spoke the comforting words, Eleanor's eyes betrayed her own terror. She'd lived in rural Montana long enough to know that men like Crawford played by their own rules, especially when they felt their authority had been challenged. Over the next several days, Crawford's psychological warfare intensified with calculated precision. His deputies made regular patrols past the ghost town, sometimes stopping to take photographs of the buildings for county records. They questioned the few remaining businesses in the area about the vagrant situation in Willowbrook, making it clear that anyone who provided assistance to Bob's group would face scrutiny from law enforcement. The harassment extended beyond mere intimidation. When Bob drove to the nearest grocery store 30 miles away, he found that his credit had mysteriously been flagged for suspicious activity. The gas station that had served him without question for 2 years suddenly required cash payment and additional identification. Phone calls to utility companies about restoring electricity to Willowbrook were met with bureaucratic delays and unexplained permitting requirements. Most disturbingly, Grace's health began to deteriorate under the stress. Her coughing fits became more frequent and severe, her lips taking on a deeper blue tinge that made Eleanor pace the floor at night like a caged animal. The child who had been slowly gaining strength on Bob's hearty meals and Eleanor's devoted care was now sliding backward, her small body unable to cope with the constant tension that permeated their sanctuary. "She needs a doctor," Eleanor said one morning, watching Grace struggle to eat a few spoonfuls of oatmeal. "Real medical attention, not just an old woman's remedies and wishful thinking." Bob nodded, though they both knew the nearest hospital was 45 minutes away, and emergency room visits cost money they didn't have. More importantly, any medical records would create a paper trail that Crawford could follow, potentially giving him legal ammunition to claim child endangerment or neglect. It was Thor who provided the solution, though not in any way Bob could have anticipated. The German Shepherd had been acting strangely for several days, disappearing for hours at a time and returning with dirt on his paws and an odd expression that Bob had learned to recognize as his problem-solving face. Dogs, especially intelligent working breeds like Thor, were natural puzzle solvers, and something about their current situation had engaged the animal's tactical mind. On a crisp morning in late October, Thor approached Bob with unusual persistence, nudging his hand and walking toward the door in the unmistakable pattern that meant, "Follow me." Bob had learned to trust these nonverbal communications implicitly. Thor's instincts had saved his life more than once, and the dog seemed to understand nuances of their situation that escaped human perception. Thor led Bob and Eleanor through the abandoned streets of Willowbrook, past the skeletal remains of houses that had once sheltered families and dreams. They walked for nearly half a mile before Thor stopped at what appeared to be an unremarkable patch of overgrown foundation stones, the remnants of a building that had been demolished or burned decades earlier. But Thor wasn't interested in the foundation. Instead, he began digging at a specific spot near what would have been the back corner of the vanished structure, his powerful claws sending dirt flying as he worked with focused intensity. After several minutes of excavation, his efforts were rewarded with the distinctive clink of metal against metal. What Thor unearthed changed everything. Buried beneath 2 feet of Montana earth was a military surplus ammunition box, green paint faded but still waterproof, sealed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested whatever was inside had been important enough to preserve. Bob's hands shook as he worked the latch free and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from decades of moisture, were documents that told the story of Willowbrook's death and Crawford's rise to power. There were original land deeds, mortgage papers, and most damning of all, a detailed ledger that recorded the true ownership of every property in the county alongside the falsified documents that had been used to steal them. The handwriting in the ledger was precise and careful, accompanied by a letter dated 8 months earlier and signed by someone named Thomas Patterson. Eleanor gasped when she saw the name. Not her husband, but his younger brother, who had worked as a clerk in the county courthouse before dying in a car accident the previous winter. "Tommy always suspected something wasn't right," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with awe and grief. "He used to say the paperwork didn't match up, that too many people were losing their property under suspicious circumstances. He must have been gathering evidence." The letter explained everything in Thomas Patterson's careful handwriting. He'd discovered that Crawford and several county officials were operating a sophisticated land grab scheme, targeting elderly property owners and using forged documents to claim ownership after the original owners died. The stolen land was then sold to developers or held for speculation, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits over nearly a decade. But Thomas Patterson had been more than just a concerned clerk. The documents revealed that he'd been conducting a methodical investigation, copying records, photographing evidence, and building a case that would have destroyed Crawford's entire operation. His death in what had been ruled a single-car accident now seemed far more sinister. "He hid this before he died," Bob said, studying the careful organization of the evidence. "He knew he was in danger, knew they were getting suspicious of his questions, so he buried the proof where only someone who really cared about the truth would think to look." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes as she held her brother-in-law's letter. "Tommy wrote that he hoped someday someone would find this, someone brave enough to use it. He said he was too scared to go to the authorities himself because he didn't know who could be trusted." The ammunition box contained more than just evidence of Crawford's crimes. There were contact cards for FBI agents and state investigators, people Thomas had researched as potential allies in his fight against corruption. There were also detailed maps showing which properties had been stolen and which were targeted for future theft, revealing the scope of an operation that extended far beyond Eleanor's small ranch. Most importantly, there were audio recordings. Thomas had apparently worn a wire during several meetings with county officials, capturing conversations that would be devastating in a courtroom. The recordings revealed not just the mechanics of the land theft scheme, but the casual cruelty with which Crawford and his associates discussed their elderly victims. "These people think they're untouchable," Bob said, listening to Crawford's voice on one of the recordings as he bragged about cleaning out the dead weight from the county. "They've been operating with impunity for so long that they've gotten careless, arrogant." But even as they celebrated their discovery, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on Bob's shoulders. Possessing evidence of corruption was one thing. Surviving long enough to present it to honest authorities was another matter entirely. Crawford had already shown his willingness to bend or break the law to achieve his goals. If he discovered that damning evidence of his crimes existed, he would undoubtedly escalate his tactics beyond intimidation and harassment. Thor seemed to sense the gravity of their situation. The dog had remained alert throughout their examination of the documents, occasionally moving to the window to scan the horizon for approaching vehicles. His behavior suggested that he understood they had just shifted from being inconvenient squatters to existential threats to Crawford's criminal empire. "We have to get this evidence to the right people," Eleanor said, carefully rewrapping the documents in their protective covering. "But how do we do that without Crawford finding out? The moment we leave Willowbrook, we're vulnerable, and if something happens to us, this evidence dies with us." Bob studied the contact information Thomas had compiled, mentally calculating distances and timing. The nearest FBI field office was in Great Falls, nearly 2 hours away by car. The Montana State Police had a barracks in Helena that was slightly closer. But any attempt to leave would be immediately noticed by Crawford's surveillance network, and the long stretches of empty highway between Willowbrook and civilization offered countless opportunities for accidents to occur. As if summoned by their fears, the distant sound of engines reached their ears. Thor's head snapped up, his body going rigid with attention. Through the broken windows of the abandoned building, they could see dust clouds on the horizon, multiple vehicles approaching at high speed. "He's coming back," Eleanor said, her voice tight with panic. "And he's not coming alone this time." Bob quickly secured the ammunition box and tucked it under his jacket. "We need to get back to Grace," he said. "Whatever Crawford's planning, he's going to use her as leverage. He knows we won't risk a child's safety, even to protect ourselves." They ran through the abandoned streets of Willowbrook, Thor ranging ahead to scout for danger, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty spaces between buildings. Behind them, the engine sounds grew louder and more ominous, carrying the promise of a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of every family Crawford had victimized over the years. The ghost town that had once offered peaceful solitude was about to become a battlefield, and Bob McKenzie found himself preparing for the most important fight of his life, not for his own survival, but for the innocent lives that depended on his willingness to stand against corruption and evil, no matter the cost. They reached the general store just as 3 sheriff's vehicles roared into the main street of Willowbrook, followed by a county building inspector's truck and what appeared to be a private security company's SUV. Crawford had clearly decided that subtle intimidation was no longer sufficient. This was an overwhelming show of force designed to crush any resistance before it could organize. Bob quickly counted 8 men emerging from the vehicles, all armed, all moving with the coordinated efficiency of a military operation. Crawford had transformed a simple eviction into something resembling a raid on a terrorist compound, complete with cameras to document what would undoubtedly be presented as a heroic rescue of a child from dangerous squatters. "Eleanor, get Grace to the back room," Bob commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "Keep her quiet, keep her calm. Whatever happens out here, don't come out until I give the all clear." Thor positioned himself at the front entrance, his body language shifting into full protection mode. The dog's hackles were raised, his ears flat against his skull, and a low, continuous growl rumbled from his chest like distant thunder. This wasn't the controlled warning he'd given Deputy Collins. This was the sound of an animal preparing for battle. Crawford approached the store with theatrical confidence, a bullhorn in one hand and a sheaf of official-looking papers in the other. His entourage spread out in a semicircle, blocking all obvious escape routes while maintaining what they probably thought were tactically sound positions. The building inspector, a nervous-looking man in his 50s, hung back near the vehicles, clearly uncomfortable with the military-style operation. "Robert Mackenzie!" Crawford's voice boomed through the bullhorn, echoing off the abandoned buildings with authoritative menace. "By order of Millfield County Child Protective Services, you are harboring a minor child in unsafe and unsanitary conditions. You have 60 seconds to surrender the child and evacuate these premises, or we will enter by force." The legal basis for the threat was transparently fabricated. Crawford had no jurisdiction over child welfare, and the paperwork he waived was almost certainly falsified. But in rural Montana, where the nearest state oversight was hours away, local sheriffs often operated with impunity, knowing that their version of events would be accepted without question. Bob stepped onto the porch, his hands visible but ready, Thor at his side like a four-legged guardian angel. "This is private property," he called back, his voice carrying clearly without artificial amplification. "You have no warrant, no probable cause, and no authority to enter my home or threaten my family." The word family seemed to trigger something in Crawford's psychological makeup. His face flushed with rage, and for a moment the careful facade of official procedure cracked, revealing the bitter, damaged man beneath the badge. "Family?" Crawford spat, his voice rising to a near shriek. "You want to talk about family? I'll tell you about family." He gestured wildly at his deputies, who exchanged uncomfortable glances. "My boy died when he was 8 years old. 8! You know why? Because we couldn't afford the surgery that might have saved him. Because the insurance company said it was experimental. Because good, decent people like me couldn't get the help we needed when it mattered." The personal revelation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, explaining so much about Crawford's twisted crusade against vulnerable families. He wasn't just stealing land for profit, he was punishing a world that had failed to save his child by ensuring that other children would suffer similar fates. "So don't you dare stand there and lecture me about family," Crawford continued, his voice cracking with old grief transformed into fresh hatred. "That little girl in there is going to die anyway. Her grandmother is too old and poor to save her. At least this way she'll die in a proper facility instead of in some filthy ruin with a crazy old veteran and his attack dog." The deputies behind Crawford shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by their boss's emotional breakdown. Even they could see that this had moved far beyond legitimate law enforcement into something personal and vengeful. The building inspector took several steps backward, apparently reconsidering his involvement in whatever was happening. Bob felt a surge of understanding mixed with revulsion. Crawford's motivation wasn't pure evil. It was grief and guilt weaponized against innocent people, a father's failure to save his own child transformed into a mission to prevent other parents from succeeding where he had failed. It was the logic of a man who had decided that if he couldn't have happiness, no one else deserved it either. "I'm sorry about your son," Bob said quietly, his voice carrying across the space between them with surprising gentleness. "No parent should have to bury a child, but hurting other children won't bring your boy back. Taking Grace away from people who love her won't ease your pain." Crawford's response was a wordless roar of fury. He gestured to his men, and 3 deputies began advancing toward the store with weapons drawn. The careful pretense of legal procedure had been abandoned. This was now a matter of raw power against moral resistance. That's when Grace appeared in the doorway behind Bob, despite Eleanor's frantic attempts to keep her hidden. The little girl was pale and unsteady, but her eyes blazed with the kind of fierce determination that sometimes emerges from the most fragile vessels. "Stop yelling at my Grandpa Bob," Grace said, her small voice somehow carrying clearly across the tension-filled space. "He's taking care of me. Grandma Ellie is taking care of me. Thor is taking care of me. We're a family now. And families don't let mean people hurt each other." The sight of the sick child standing bravely in the doorway had an electric effect on the assembled law enforcement officers. Several deputies lowered their weapons slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the optics of armed men threatening a little girl who could barely stand upright. The building inspector took out his phone, apparently deciding to document whatever was about to happen for his own protection. Crawford stared at Grace with an expression of pure anguish, seeing perhaps an echo of his own lost son in her fragile courage. For a moment Bob thought the sheriff might back down, might recognize the futility and cruelty of his mission. But then Crawford's face hardened again, grief calcifying into renewed determination. "Take her," he commanded his deputies. "Use whatever force is necessary. The old woman and the veteran are clearly unfit guardians. The child needs proper medical care in a controlled environment." 3 deputies resumed their advance, but they moved reluctantly, clearly questioning the wisdom and legality of their orders. Thor sensed their approach and positioned himself directly in front of Grace, his body language making it clear that reaching the child would require going through 65 pounds of trained protection dog. Bob stepped forward to join Thor, placing himself between the advancing officers and his makeshift family. "This ends here," he said with quiet finality. "I've seen enough good people hurt by systems that were supposed to protect them. I've buried enough innocents who deserved better. You want to take Grace? You'll have to go through me first." Eleanor appeared beside Bob, her own frail body adding to the human barrier protecting her granddaughter. "And me," she said firmly. "I've lost everything else. I won't lose her too." The standoff stretched taut as a violin string, armed law enforcement officers facing down an elderly woman, a disabled veteran, a sick child, and a loyal dog. The deputies looked increasingly uncomfortable, recognizing that any use of force would be difficult to justify in court, especially with the building inspector's phone camera recording everything. Then Thor did something extraordinary. Instead of growling or showing aggression, the German shepherd sat down calmly in front of Grace and began to whine, not with fear, but with the kind of distressed vocalization that dogs use to communicate urgent need. His amber eyes fixed on Crawford with an intensity that was almost human in its emotional depth. The sound seemed to pierce through Crawford's rage like a knife through cloth. For the first time since arriving, the sheriff really looked at the scene in front of him, not as an obstacle to his authority, but as a tableau of love and protection that mirrored everything he'd failed to provide for his own child. "Sir," one of the younger deputies said hesitantly, "maybe we should reconsider. The situation doesn't look like what we were told to expect." Crawford stood frozen, his bullhorn forgotten at his side, staring at Grace and Thor with an expression of dawning horror at what he'd almost done. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, everyone waiting to see whether compassion or vengeance would ultimately triumph in the heart of a grieving father who had lost his way. The standoff shattered when Grace suddenly collapsed. One moment she was standing bravely behind Thor, her small voice still echoing with defiant protection of her chosen family. The next, her legs simply gave way, and she crumpled to the wooden porch like a discarded doll, her already pale lips turning a terrifying shade of blue that made Eleanor scream with primal maternal terror. "Grace!" Eleanor dropped to her knees beside her granddaughter, her weathered hands fluttering helplessly over the child's still form. Grace's breathing had become shallow and erratic, her small chest rising and falling with the desperate irregularity of a failing heart pushed beyond its limits by stress and fear. Thor immediately abandoned his defensive posture, whining frantically as he nudged Grace's motionless hand with his nose. The dog's distress was heartbreaking to witness. He paced in tight circles around the child, his intelligent eyes darting between Grace's face and the adults who were supposed to be able to fix everything but clearly couldn't. Bob knelt beside Eleanor, his military first aid training taking over as he checked Grace's pulse. What he found made his blood run cold. Her heartbeat was wildly irregular, skipping and racing like a broken machine trying to function with damaged parts. This wasn't just exhaustion or fear, this was a cardiac event, possibly fatal without immediate medical intervention. "She needs a hospital," Bob said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Right now. Not in an hour, not after paperwork gets filed. Now!" Crawford stood frozen 20 feet away, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. His deputies had lowered their weapons completely, several of them looking sick at the sight of a child suffering while they'd been prepared to use force against her protectors. The building inspector had stopped recording and was fumbling with his phone, apparently trying to call for medical assistance. "The nearest cardiac unit is 2 hours away," one of the younger deputies said, his voice cracking with stress. "Even with lights and sirens, by the time we get her there—" He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone present understood the mathematics of rural emergency medicine. Too much distance, too little time, too few resources. Grace was dying in front of them, and the very system that Crawford claimed would save her was proving inadequate to the task. Dr. Helen Foster arrived like an answered prayer, her veterinary clinic truck skidding to a stop behind the law enforcement vehicles. The 60-year-old veterinarian had apparently heard the commotion on her emergency scanner and driven out to offer whatever help she could provide. Rural vets often served as unofficial emergency medical personnel when human doctors weren't available, and Dr. Foster had treated everything from heart attacks to chainsaw injuries during her decades of practice. She rushed to Grace's side with a medical bag that contained equipment designed for animals but adaptable for emergency human care. "How long has she been unconscious?" she asked tersely, already checking the child's vitals with professional efficiency. 2 minutes, maybe 3, Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She just collapsed. 1 second she was talking, the next." Dr. Foster's examination was swift but thorough. She listened to Grace's heart with a stethoscope, checked her pulse at multiple points, and observed the bluish tinge around her lips and fingernails with the grim recognition of someone who'd seen similar symptoms before. "Severe cardiac arrhythmia," she announced grimly. "Her heart is essentially misfiring, beating too fast, too slow, sometimes not at all. Without surgical intervention, she has maybe hours, possibly less." The doctor's words hit the assembled group like physical blows. Crawford's face went white, his earlier rage replaced by something that looked remarkably like horror. He was staring at Grace's still form with the expression of a man suddenly understanding the true consequences of his actions. "What about that experimental pediatric cardiac unit in Denver?" Dr. Foster asked, apparently thinking aloud. "They've been doing remarkable work with congenital heart defects. If we could get her there—" "Denver's 4 hours by car," Bob said flatly. "She doesn't have 4 hours." That's when Crawford did something that shocked everyone present, including his own deputies. He holstered his weapon and walked slowly toward the group clustered around Grace, his movements careful and non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. "There's a medical helicopter based at Malmstrom Air Force Base," he said quietly. "Emergency medical evacuation for critically injured military personnel. It could reach Denver in 90 minutes." He paused, swallowing hard. "I have contacts there. People who owe me favors from my time in the service." Bob stared at Crawford with suspicion and dawning hope. "Why would you help her? 10 minutes ago you were ready to tear her away from her family." Crawford's face crumpled, years of carefully maintained authority dissolving like salt in rain. "Because she's the same age my Tommy was when he died," he whispered. "Because I've been fighting the wrong war, punishing the wrong people. And because maybe if I save her, some small part of my boy's death will mean something." The confession hung in the air like a prayer, raw and desperate and absolutely sincere. Crawford pulled out his satellite phone with trembling hands and began making calls, his voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone who knew how to cut through military bureaucracy when lives were at stake. While Crawford worked his connections, Dr. Foster did everything possible to stabilize Grace's failing heart. She administered medication from her veterinary supplies, drugs designed for animals but chemically identical to human cardiac medications. She monitored Grace's vital signs and provided oxygen from a portable tank that she normally used for surgery on large animals. Thor never left Grace's side throughout the medical crisis. The German shepherd seemed to understand that something profound was happening, positioning himself where he could maintain physical contact with the unconscious child while staying out of Dr. Foster's way. Occasionally, the dog would whine softly and nuzzle Grace's hand, as if trying to call her back from whatever dark place her consciousness had retreated to. Eleanor held her granddaughter's other hand, whispering stories and promises and apologies that Grace couldn't hear, but that seemed to provide comfort to the woman speaking them. Bob stood guard over the entire scene, his military instincts still alert for threats, even as his heart broke watching a child fight for her life. Crawford's phone calls produced results with remarkable speed. Military medicine operated on different principles than civilian healthcare. When a life was at stake, bureaucracy took a back seat to action. Within 20 minutes, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors could be heard approaching from the north. The medical evacuation helicopter that landed in Willowbrook's Main Street was a sophisticated aircraft equipped with life support systems that rivaled most hospital emergency rooms. The flight medics who emerged were Air Force pararescue specialists trained to provide trauma care in hostile environments. They took one look at Grace's condition and began preparing her for immediate transport with professional efficiency. "Family can come," the lead medic announced, checking his equipment. "We have room for 2 passengers plus the patient." Eleanor and Bob exchanged glances. The choice should have been obvious: grandmother and grandfather figure accompanying the sick child. But Thor complicated the equation. The dog had been Grace's constant companion and emotional support, and separating them now seemed cruel and potentially counterproductive. "The dog comes too," Bob said firmly. "He's not just a pet. He's her therapy animal, and she's going to need all the emotional support she can get." The medic looked skeptical. "We don't normally transport animals, especially not in emergency situations." Crawford stepped forward, his uniform lending authority to his words. "That dog is a certified therapy animal providing critical emotional support to a minor child." He lied smoothly. "Federal regulations require accommodation for service animals in medical transport situations." The medic shrugged, apparently deciding that arguing with a sheriff about federal regulations wasn't worth the delay. "Fine. But the dog behaves himself or he gets sedated." Thor seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He allowed himself to be lifted into the helicopter and positioned next to Grace's stretcher, where he immediately lay down and placed his head near her hand. Even unconscious, Grace seemed to respond to the dog's presence, her breathing becoming slightly more regular. As the helicopter prepared for takeoff, Crawford approached Bob one final time. The sheriff's face was streaked with tears he wasn't trying to hide, and his voice shook with emotion he'd suppressed for too long. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For everything. For my son, for your family, for the families I've hurt. I can't undo what I've done, but I can make sure Grace gets the care she needs." He paused, looking older than his 52 years. "When this is over, when she's safe, I'll turn myself in. Tell the authorities everything. The evidence, the land theft, all of it." Bob studied Crawford's face, seeing not the corrupt sheriff who'd terrorized them, but a broken father who'd finally found a way to honor his dead son's memory. "Grace is going to live," Bob said with quiet certainty. "And when she does, she's going to need good people in her life. People who understand that redemption is possible, even for those who've made terrible mistakes." The helicopter lifted off into the Montana sky, carrying Grace toward hope and healing, while below in the ghost town of Willowbrook, the men who'd been enemies just hours before began the difficult process of learning how to forgive themselves and each other. The battle for Grace's life was just beginning, but the war for her soul and theirs had already been won by the simple recognition that love was stronger than vengeance, and that sometimes the most broken people were capable of the greatest acts of redemption. 6 months later, the ghost town of Willowbrook had been reborn as Hope's Landing, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Where skeletal buildings had once stood like tombstones marking the death of dreams, vibrant structures now housed a growing community of 47 residents. The main street that had been choked with weeds now featured carefully tended gardens and freshly painted storefronts. Children's laughter echoed between buildings that had known only silence for decades. At the heart of this resurrection stood the General Store, now expanded and renovated into a combination community center, medical clinic, and family home. Eleanor Patterson had found her calling as the town's unofficial nurse practitioner, using her decades of experience and Dr. Foster's mentorship to provide basic health care to residents who couldn't afford the long journey to county medical facilities. Her gentle hands, which had once trembled with fear and uncertainty, now moved with confident purpose as she treated everything from scraped knees to high blood pressure. Bob McKenzie had surprised everyone, including himself, by emerging as Hope's Landing's natural leader. The man who'd come seeking isolation had discovered that his true gift lay in bringing people together. His combination of military discipline, practical problem-solving skills, and hard-earned wisdom made him the person others instinctively turned to when challenges arose. The town council had unanimously elected him mayor, a position he accepted with characteristic humility and dry humor. "At my age, I figured my governing days were behind me," he'd said during his acceptance speech, delivered from the steps of the renovated general store. "Turns out the Lord had other plans." Sometimes he speaks through burning bushes, sometimes through the bark of a loyal dog who knows where to dig for buried treasure. Thor had become something of a celebrity, not just in Hope's Landing but throughout rural Montana. The story of the German shepherd who'd led his human family to evidence of corruption had captured the imagination of local media, but more importantly, Thor had found his true calling as a therapy dog. He divided his time between visiting elderly residents who needed companionship and serving as a constant guardian for Grace, who had grown into a healthy, vibrant 10-year-old with dreams as big as the Montana sky. Grace's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The experimental surgery performed at Denver Children's Hospital had given her a new heart valve constructed from cutting-edge biocompatible materials, allowing her natural heart to function normally for the first time in her young life. More than that, The experience had given her a sense of purpose that belied her years. She'd become an advocate for rural healthcare access, speaking at community meetings with the poise of someone who'd stared death in the face and emerged with stories to tell. "Hearts can be fixed," she would say during her presentations, Thor sitting regally beside her. "Broken hearts, scared hearts, angry hearts, they can all learn to beat differently. Better, stronger." Her words carried weight because everyone knew she'd lived them. The financial foundation for Hope's Landing's transformation had come from an unexpected source. Crawford's cooperation with federal investigators had led to the recovery of over $3 million in stolen assets, money that had been systematically looted from rural families over nearly a decade. The courts had ordered full restitution to victims, but many of the affected families had chosen to reinvest their recovered funds into the community that had given them hope. Crawford himself had become perhaps the most complicated figure in Hope's Landing's story. Currently serving a reduced sentence of 12 years in federal prison, he'd become a model inmate and advocate for prison reform. His letters to Bob arrived monthly, filled with apologies, updates on his rehabilitation programs, and surprisingly insightful observations about justice and redemption. Eleanor had visited him twice, carrying messages from Grace and photographs of the community he'd helped save through his final act of decency. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Eleanor had explained to Grace during one of their bedtime conversations. "It means choosing to remember differently. Sheriff Crawford did terrible things, but in the end, he chose to be better than his worst moment." That's what grace really means, getting a chance to become who you were always meant to be. The memorial garden Bob had originally planned for Margaret had evolved into something far more expansive and meaningful. Located at the center of Hope's Landing, it now honored not just Margaret Mackenzie, but Crawford's son Tommy and all the children who'd been lost to systemic failures in rural health care. A bronze plaque bore the inscription, "In memory of those we couldn't save, in honor of those we can." Grace had insisted on adding a section specifically for therapy animals, with Thor's paw print prominently displayed in wet cement alongside those of other four-legged heroes. Dr. Helen Foster had relocated her veterinary practice to Hope's Landing, establishing the region's first combined human-animal medical facility. Her innovative approach to rural health care, treating both livestock and their human families, had attracted attention from medical schools across the country. Students regularly came to observe her work, learning how compassion and creativity could overcome resource limitations. The economic revival of Hope's Landing had attracted young families back to the area, reversing decades of rural decline. Small businesses were flourishing. A cafe run by a former Denver chef who'd wanted to escape city life, a craft brewery operated by 2 military veterans, an organic farm that supplied fresh produce to restaurants 3 counties away. The success stories were modest but meaningful, proof that rural America could thrive when people had reason to hope. Bob's own transformation had been equally profound. The man who'd arrived in Willowbrook carrying 47 years of survivor's guilt and PTSD had discovered that purpose was the most powerful antidote to psychological wounds. He'd started a veterans support group that met weekly in the community center, providing a safe space for former soldiers to share their struggles and victories. His combination of military experience and hard-won wisdom about healing made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate the difficult transition from military to civilian life. "I spent decades asking why I survived when better men didn't," he would tell new group members. "Turns out I was asking the wrong question. The real question isn't why you survived, it's what you're going to do with the life you've been given." Thor's role in the community had evolved beyond therapy work. The German Shepherd had become something of a mentor to other dogs, teaching them how to provide emotional support to humans in need. His calm intelligence and protective instincts had influenced an entire generation of Hope's Landing pets, creating what Eleanor laughingly called Thor's School of Canine Citizenship. On quiet evenings, Bob would often find himself sitting on the porch of the general store with Eleanor and Grace, watching Thor patrol the main street with the satisfied air of a security guard whose shift was going well. The conversations during these twilight hours ranged from practical community business to philosophical discussions about the nature of family, belonging, and second chances. "You know what I learned from all this?" Grace said one evening, her healthy complexion glowing in the sunset light. "Love doesn't work like arithmetic. It doesn't get smaller when you divide it among more people. It gets bigger. Like Thor's love for all of us, or Grandpa Bob's love for the whole town, or how Sheriff Crawford's love for his son eventually turned into love for me too." Eleanor smiled, pulling Grace closer on the porch swing. "Where did you learn to be so wise, little one?" "From Thor," Grace replied matter-of-factly. "Dogs understand love better than people sometimes. They don't overthink it or make it complicated. They just love with their whole hearts every day, no matter what." Bob reached down to scratch Thor's ears, marveling at how much his life had changed since that day he'd paid $100 for what he'd thought would be his final resting place. Instead of finding an ending, he'd discovered a beginning. Instead of isolation, he'd found family. Instead of silence, he'd found purpose. "At my age, tomorrow still isn't guaranteed," he said, echoing words he'd spoken many times over the past months. "But today, surrounded by this family, with Thor by my side and Margaret smiling down from heaven, today is more than enough. Today is everything." As the Montana stars emerged in the darkening sky above Hope's Landing, the ghost town that had learned to live again settled into peaceful slumber, its residents secure in the knowledge that sometimes the most broken places and people were capable of the most beautiful transformations. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we stop running from our pain and start walking toward purpose. Bob McKenzie thought he was buying silence for $100, but what he found was something far more precious. Proof that it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. At 68, this lonely veteran discovered that the family you choose can be stronger than the one you're born into, and that a loyal dog's love can guide you to treasures buried deeper than gold. In a world that often makes us feel invisible or forgotten, Bob's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten. His journey from isolation to community leader, from survivor's guilt to purposeful service, shows us that second chances aren't just for the young, they're for anyone brave enough to open their heart to unexpected possibilities. Thor didn't just lead Bob to evidence, he led him to healing, to family, to the profound joy that comes from knowing your life still matters. Sometimes God speaks through burning bushes, sometimes through the bark of a faithful friend who knows exactly where hope is buried. What unexpected companion has led you to discover hidden strengths in your life? Have you ever found family in the most surprising places?